On September 12, 1962, at Rice University in Houston, Texas, President John Kennedy may well have delivered the most memorable and important speech of his presidency from the perspective of the goal it set in motion. It was certainly an inspired and inspiring speech which spoke to the best within the American experience. It made Apollo 11 and our moon landing on July 20th, 1969 inevitable, but not necessarily for the reasons made obvious in his speech. It was Kennedy's assassination in Texas the following year that framed this powerful speech and made going to the moon the ultimate tribute to our slain president, as author Charles Fishman explains so brilliantly, as he does so much more about the Apollo missions in his new book, One Giant Leap: The Impossible Mission That Flew Us to the Moon. Mr. Fishman carefully explains his well-documented view that had Kennedy lived, it is almost certain the Apollo program almost certainly would not have been undertaken, because the enthusiasm Kennedy expressed in his Rice University speech is not reflected in many of his other actions, and his lack of interest in sending Americans to the moon he expressed at other times. Fishman presents detailed context. First of all, in Kennedy's view, and many others, the only real purpose for going to the moon was to ensure the Russians did not get there first, not the grand vision in Kennedy's moon speech at Rice University. This was all about the Cold War. This was the reason for Kennedy's enthusiasm. It was a clearly political decision. Following the September 1962 speech, when it became obvious that Russia had no real path to the moon, President Kennedy was very likely to abandon the goal. Fishman goes further and presents the case Kennedy was never a space enthusiast. His scientific interest was far more prosaic. His dream of the United States mastering the science of turning seawater economically into salt-free water for human use. Fishman believes Kennedy would have reduced the idea of going to the moon to some vague, distant possibility once his re-election campaign began. In fact, President Kennedy's prepared speech for the Trade Mart in Dallas on November 22, 1963, which he never delivered, was to be the unofficial start to his re-election campaign, and in it there is not one word about going to the moon. It was then Vice President Lyndon Johnson who had a passion for the United States space program and for going to the moon, and who, upon becoming president, made landing Americans on the moon a tribute to his slain predecessor, and Johnson who placed the massive funds in the federal budget that made it a reality. Let's also keep in mind, as Fishman explains in his book, while there was interest in space among the American people, it was never overwhelming. Even less precise interest for going to the moon, especially since there were so many other demands on the federal budget and so much political and racial chaos in our country during the 1960s. While all this is essential to the full story of Apollo 11 and the greatest achievement in human history, all this background doesn't matter much because, in fact, as explained, President Kennedy's speech, which follows in only slightly edited form here, and President Kennedy himself was indeed responsible for the success of Apollo. And the reality of our going to the moon was and is America's greatest, in fact, impossible achievement so far. Had Kennedy lived, we would inevitably still have gone to the moon. But it would have been long after Kennedy's presidency, maybe 20 or even 30 years later. The one irony of going when we did, and its real purpose to beat the Russians there, then as a tribute to President Kennedy, is that getting there was the only goal, and so there was no plan at all to stay there and make our presence permanent. Had the first moon landing been 10, 20, or 30 years later, just going there and not staying there would have been seen as foolish and wasteful. Ironically, had the first moon landing come later, today there would be a permanent and growing American presence on the moon, instead of, in fact, none at all 50 years after Apollo. Now is the time to correct that massive, wasteful mistake and historic failure. So now listen to Kennedy's famous speech with fresh ears, knowing that its historical context is no longer important. That, in fact, President Kennedy's words truly ring true today.
For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old, new ignorance, new problems, new dangers. Surely the opening vistas of space promise high costs and hardships, as well as high reward. So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. But this city of Houston, this state of Texas, this country of the United States was not built by those who waited and rested and wished to look behind them. This country was conquered by those who move forward, and so will space. William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. In short, our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men, and to become the world's leading spacefaring nation. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man. And only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war. I do not say that we should or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space, any more than we go unprotected against the hostile use of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. It is for these reasons that I regard the decision last year to shift our efforts in space from low to high gear as among the most important decisions that will be made during my incumbency in the office of the presidency. In the last 24 hours, we have seen facilities now being created for the greatest and most complex exploration in man's history. We have felt the ground shake and the air shattered by the testing of a Saturn C-1 booster rocket, many times as powerful as the Atlas which launched John Glenn, generating power equivalents to 10,000 automobiles with their accelerator on the floor. We have seen the site where 5 F-1 rocket engines, each one as powerful as all 8 engines of the Saturn combined, will be clustered together to make the advanced Saturn missile, assembled in a new building to be built at Cape Canaveral, as tall as a 48-story structure, as wide as a city block, and as long as 2 lengths of this field. Transit satellites are helping our ships at sea to steer a safer course. Tireless satellites have given us unprecedented warnings of hurricanes and storms, and will do the same for forest fires and icebergs. We have had our failures, but so have others, even if they do not admit them, and they may be less public. To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade we shall make up and move ahead. The growth of our science and education will be enriched by new knowledge of our universe and environment, by new techniques of learning and mapping and observation, by new tools and computers for industry, medicine, and the home as well as the school. Technical institutions such as Rice will reap the harvest of these gains. And finally, the space effort itself, while still in its infancy, has already created a great number of new companies and tens and thousands of new jobs. Space and related industries are generating new demands in investment and skilled personnel. To be sure, all this costs us all a good deal of money. This year's space budget is 3 times what it was in January 1961, and it is greater than the space budget of the previous 8 years combined. That budget now stands at $5.4 billion a year, a staggering sum, though somewhat less than we pay for cigarettes and cigars every year. Space expenditures will soon rise some more, from 40 cents per person per week to more than 50 cents a week for every man, woman, and child in the United States. For we have given this program a high national priority, even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold. However, I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done, and it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.